Tonight, we are stepping through a doorway into another time, a time painted in pastel colors and polished chrome, where the air smelled of fresh coffee and hairspray, where every surface gleamed with the promise of modernity, and where beneath the carefully arranged curtains and matching dish sets, there existed a secret that would only whisper itself in the quietest corners of suburban homes. We are traveling back to the 1950s, to the world of the American housewife, to an era when perfection was not merely a goal, but an unspoken commandment, and when the tools to achieve that perfection came not just from the pages of magazines or the aisles of department stores, but from small glass bottles tucked discreetly in medicine cabinets, prescribed with a smile and dispensed without question. This is a story about amphetamines, about energy that never quite felt natural, about the relentless pursuit of an impossible standard, and about the women who lived through it all with grace, exhaustion, and a quiet resilience that history often overlooks. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten corners of history, to the strange and unsettling truths hidden beneath the surface of familiar stories, then perhaps you will join us again as we explore more of these twilight tales. For now, let the world around you soften, let the light dim, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift back through the decades to a time when the suburbs were new, the future was bright, and the cost of keeping up appearances was higher than anyone dared to say aloud. Imagine, if you will, a neighborhood in the heart of America in the year 1957. The lawns are immaculate, trimmed with precision and edged with military discipline. The driveways are wide and empty during the day, waiting for the return of station wagons and sedans. The houses themselves are modest but proud, each one a testament to post-war optimism, each one a small castle in the expanding empire of Suburbia. Inside these homes, the kitchens are bright and clean, filled with the latest appliances, refrigerators that hum with quiet efficiency, stoves that promise even heat, dishwashers that glisten with chrome and promise, and always, always, the percolator bubbling on the counter, filling the air with the rich, bitter scent of fresh brewed coffee. This is the world we are entering, a world where mornings begin before the sun has fully risen, where the day unfolds in a carefully choreographed sequence of tasks, each one necessary, each one urgent, each one another step in the never-ending dance of domestic life. The housewife wakes not to an alarm clock, but to the silent pressure of expectation, to the knowledge that there are lunches to be packed, breakfasts to be cooked, shirts to be ironed, floors to be swept, and children to be dressed, all before the clock strikes 9. There is no time for hesitation, no room for doubt, and certainly no space for exhaustion. But exhaustion is always there, lurking in the margins, waiting to creep in during the quiet moments between tasks. It is a familiar companion, an unwelcome guest that never quite leaves, and in the 1950s there is a solution for that, a modern solution, a scientific solution, a solution that comes in a small bottle with a friendly label and a doctor's recommendation. Amphetamines, benzedrine, dexedrine, mother's little helper. The names change, the packaging varies, but the promise is always the same. Energy, focus, the ability to keep going when the body wants to stop, the power to be everything that is expected, everything that is required, everything that the world demands of a woman whose job title is simply wife and mother. The sun is beginning to rise now, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And inside one particular house, inside a bedroom decorated in soft florals and pale blues, a woman opens her eyes. Her name does not matter, not really, because she could be any one of thousands, any one of the women who wake to this same routine, who face this same pressure, who reach for this same solution. She lies still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house beginning to stir, the creak of floorboards, the distant murmur of the radio, the soft breathing of her husband beside her, and then she rises, moving quietly, her movements practiced and efficient, the movements of someone who has done this 1,000 times before and will do it 1,000 times again. The first task of the morning is to make herself presentable, even before anyone else is awake, even before the day has truly begun. She moves to the vanity, studies her reflection in the mirror, sees the faint lines beginning to form around her eyes, the slight droop of fatigue that no amount of cold cream seems to erase, and she reaches into the drawer, past the handkerchiefs and the hairpins, to the small bottle that waits there. One pill, just one, swallowed with a sip of water from the glass on the nightstand. It is a familiar ritual, as routine as brushing her teeth or pinning her hair, and within minutes she feels the change, the subtle shift in her body as the chemistry takes hold, as her heart begins to beat a little faster, as her mind sharpens, as the fog of sleep lifts and is replaced by a bright, humming alertness that feels almost like confidence. Now she can begin. Now she can face the day. Now she can be the woman she is supposed to be. The kitchen becomes her stage, and she moves through it with the grace of a performer who knows every line, every cue, every mark. The coffee is brewed, dark and strong, filling the house with its aroma. The bacon is laid out in the pan, sizzling and popping, the fat rendering and pooling at the edges. The eggs are cracked, their yolks bright and round, sliding into the skillet with a gentle hiss. The toast is sliced, buttered, arranged on a plate with the crusts facing the same direction because presentation matters, because even breakfast is a performance, because nothing can be careless or haphazard in a world where every detail is scrutinized, where every meal is a measure of worth. The children appear, rumpled and sleepy, trailing blankets and stuffed animals, and she ushers them to the table with gentle efficiency, pouring milk, cutting toast into manageable pieces, wiping faces, combing hair, offering encouragement and reminders in equal measure. Her husband emerges, dressed for work, tie knotted, briefcase in hand, and he sits at the head of the table, unfolding the newspaper, accepting his breakfast with a nod and a murmur of thanks, and she stands behind him, refilling his coffee, smoothing the tablecloth, already thinking ahead to the next task, the next chore, the next challenge waiting just beyond the doorway. This is the rhythm of the morning, the clockwork precision of a household running smoothly, and to the outside observer, it appears effortless, natural, the inevitable result of good planning and good character. But beneath the surface, beneath the smile and the starched apron, there is the constant hum of chemical energy, the artificial brightness that makes it all possible, the little white pill that transforms exhaustion into efficiency, that turns dread into determination, that allows her to be everywhere at once, to do everything that is required, to never falter, never slow, never admit that she is anything less than perfectly capable. The morning stretches on, and the tasks multiply. The breakfast dishes are cleared, washed, dried, and put away, each one returned to its proper place in the cupboard. The counters are wiped down, the floor is swept, the crumbs are collected and disposed of, and the kitchen returns to its spotless state, ready for the next meal, the next performance. The children are dressed in their school clothes, their hair combed, their faces washed, their lunches packed in brown paper bags with their names written in neat cursive on the outside. The beds are made, the pillows fluffed, the quilt smoothed, every wrinkle erased, every surface neat and orderly. And still, there is more to do. The laundry waits in its basket, a mountain of fabric that must be sorted, washed, dried, folded, and put away. The living room needs to be vacuumed, the cushions straightened, the magazines arranged in a fan on the coffee table. The bathroom requires scrubbing, the sink polished, the mirror wiped clean of any smudges or spots. The windows need washing, the floors need mopping, the curtains need adjusting, and all of it must be done before the afternoon, before the children return from school, before her husband comes home expecting dinner and conversation, and the pleasant illusion that none of this requires any effort at all. But it does require effort. It requires immense effort, relentless effort, the kind of effort that would break most people, and the only thing that makes it possible is the chemical assistance that courses through her veins, the amphetamines that keep her moving, keep her focused, keep her from collapsing under the weight of all these expectations. She does not think about the cost. Not now, not yet. She does not think about the way her hands tremble slightly when she holds a glass, or the way her heart sometimes skips a beat, or the way sleep has become something distant and elusive, something she chases but never quite catches. She does not think about any of that, because there is no time to think, no space for reflection, only the next task, the next responsibility, the next item on the endless list. The neighborhood around her is alive with similar rhythms, similar routines, similar secrets. In the house next door, another woman is vacuuming her living room with the same manic energy, her movements quick and precise, her eyes bright with the same artificial clarity. Across the street, another woman is ironing shirts with a focus that borders on obsession, pressing each collar, each cuff, each seam with meticulous care. Her jaw clenched, her posture rigid, her entire being concentrated on the task at hand. Down the block, another woman is baking, her kitchen filled with the scent of vanilla and sugar, her hands moving rapidly as she mixes, pours, measures, and shapes, creating perfect cookies, perfect cakes, perfect evidence of her competence and her worth. They do not speak of it, these women. They do not gather at the mailbox or over the back fence and admit that they are all running on the same fuel, all relying on the same chemical crutch, all dependent on the same little bottles that their doctors prescribe so freely. Instead, they exchange pleasantries, they share recipes, they compliment each other's gardens and each other's children, and they maintain the fiction that everything is fine, that they are all coping beautifully, that the demands placed upon them are reasonable and manageable and not at all overwhelming. But in the quiet moments, in the brief pauses between tasks, in the seconds before sleep finally claims them in the early hours of the morning, they know the truth. They know that they are all struggling, all exhausted, all held together by willpower and prescription medication and the desperate need to keep up appearances. The pharmaceutical companies know this too, of course. They see the opportunity, the vast and lucrative market of tired women, anxious women, women who are expected to be perfect but given no real support, no real resources, no real acknowledgement of the impossibility of their situation. The advertisements are everywhere, in the pages of women's magazines, in the backs of medical journals, even on the radio and the television. They show smiling women, energetic women, women who have discovered the secret to boundless energy and endless patience. They use words like pep and vitality and modern living, and they promise that with just a small pill, just a tiny dose, any woman can be transformed, can become the ideal that society demands, can keep her house spotless and her children happy and her husband satisfied without ever showing a hint of strain. And the doctors, the trusted family physicians who sit in their offices and listen to women describe their fatigue, their nervousness, their inability to keep up with the demands of daily life, these doctors nod sympathetically and reach for their prescription pads without hesitation. They are not cruel men, not intentionally. They believe they are helping, believe they are providing a solution to a real problem, believe that modern medicine has given them the tools to make life easier for their patients. They do not ask deeper questions, do not wonder whether the problem might be the expectations themselves rather than the women's inability to meet them, do not consider that perhaps the solution should not be chemical, but social, structural, systemic. Instead, they write the prescription, hand it over with a reassuring smile, and send the women on their way, back to their homes, back to their endless tasks, back to their carefully maintained illusions of effortless perfection. The afternoons in Suburbia have a particular quality, a stillness that settles over the neighborhood once the children have been sent off to school and the husbands have departed for their offices. The streets are quiet, the houses are closed up, and behind each front door, the women of the neighborhood continue their work, continue their performances, continue their relentless pursuit of domestic excellence. The vacuums hum, the washing machines churn, the irons hiss with steam, and the women themselves move through their homes with a kind of restless energy that never quite dissipates, never quite allows them to sit down, to rest, to simply be still for a moment. This is when the pressure is most acute, in these quiet hours when there is no one to witness the effort, no one to offer praise or acknowledgement, no one to see the woman scrubbing the grout between the bathroom tiles with a toothbrush, or reorganizing the pantry for the third time this month, or standing in front of the linen closet debating whether the towels should be arranged by color or by size. These are the hours when the amphetamines do their most important work, when they transform anxiety into action, when they turn the nagging voice of inadequacy into a driving force for productivity, when they make it possible to find meaning and purpose in tasks that might otherwise feel meaningless and repetitive. But there is a cost to this, a cost that accumulates slowly, imperceptibly, like dust gathering in the corners of a room that has been cleaned 1,000 times, but never quite perfectly. The cost is measured in sleepless nights, in the way the body begins to rebel against the constant chemical stimulation, in the way the heart races and the hands shake and the mind refuses to quiet even when the work is done. It is measured in the moments of panic, the sudden, overwhelming sense that everything is falling apart, that the facade is crumbling, that the mask is slipping, and soon everyone will see the truth underneath. It is measured in the tears shed in private, in the pantry or the bathroom or the car parked in the driveway, tears that come without warning and without clear cause, tears that are the body's way of protesting, of demanding rest, of insisting that this cannot continue forever. The women do not speak of these moments, not to each other, not to their husbands, not even to their doctors. They wipe their eyes, reapply their lipstick, take another pill, and carry on, because that is what is expected, because that is what they have been taught to do. Because the alternative, the admission of weakness or failure or simple human limitation, is unthinkable in a culture that values stoicism and self-reliance above all else. And so the cycle continues, day after day, week after week, year after year, each woman locked in her own private struggle, each woman convinced that she is the only one who finds it difficult, each woman certain that if she could just try harder, be better, do more, then everything would be fine. The children return from school in the afternoon, bursting through the front door with shouts and laughter and demands for snacks, and the house comes alive again with noise and movement and the chaotic energy of young lives being lived. The woman shifts gears, shifts roles, becomes not just housekeeper, but mother, caregiver, homework supervisor, referee, and entertainer. She pours glasses of milk, she cuts apples into slices, she listens to stories about the school day, she mediates disputes over toys and turns at the television, and all the while she is still thinking ahead, still planning, still preparing for the next phase of the day. Dinner looms large in the afternoon consciousness of the housewife, a meal that must be planned, shopped for, prepared, and served with the same attention to detail as every other aspect of her domestic responsibilities. The meal must be nutritious, must be appealing, must be presented attractively, and must be ready at precisely the right time, not too early so that it grows cold, not too late so that hungry children and an impatient husband are kept waiting. She consults her cookbooks, her magazine clippings, her mental inventory of ingredients in the pantry and the refrigerator, and she makes her decisions, choosing recipes that will please, that will nourish, that will demonstrate her competence and her care. The preparation of dinner becomes another performance, another opportunity to prove her worth. She moves through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, chopping vegetables, seasoning meat, mixing sauces, setting timers, monitoring temperatures, tasting and adjusting, always adjusting, striving for perfection in every dish. The table is set with care, plates and silverware arranged with geometric precision, napkins folded just so, glasses filled with ice water, everything ready for the moment when her husband walks through the door and the family gathers for the evening meal. And when that moment comes, when he arrives home from work, loosening his tie, setting down his briefcase, greeting her with a kiss on the cheek and a comment about how good everything smells, she smiles, she accepts the compliment, she ushers everyone to the table, and she serves the meal she has prepared, moving from stove to table with dishes held carefully in hands that might tremble just slightly if anyone were paying close enough attention. But no one is paying that kind of attention. They are focused on the food, on their own hunger, on their own conversations, and she fades into the background, a supporting player in the drama of family life, essential but unnoticed, appreciated but not truly seen. The evenings have a rhythm of their own, a winding down that is never quite complete, never quite allows for true rest. After dinner, there are dishes to be washed, surfaces to be cleaned, leftovers to be stored, children to be bathed and read to and tucked into bed, homework to be checked, permission slips to be signed, clothes to be laid out for the next morning. Her husband retires to the living room, to his newspaper or his television program, to the comfortable chair that has molded itself to his shape. And she continues her work, continues her rounds through the house, continues to straighten and tidy and prepare, because tomorrow is another day and it will bring another set of demands, and she must be ready. But beneath this routine, beneath this carefully maintained surface, there is a growing unease, a sense that something is not quite right, that the solution she has been relying on is perhaps not a solution at all, but merely a postponement, a way of pushing the problem further into the future rather than truly addressing it. The pills that once gave her energy now seem to give her only a jittery restlessness, a feeling of being simultaneously exhausted and unable to stop moving. The sleep that once came eventually, even if fitfully, now eludes her entirely, leaving her to lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through lists and worries and imagined disasters, her heart pounding in her chest, her body tense and uncomfortable no matter how she arranges the pillows or adjusts the blankets. She begins to notice things she had not noticed before, small signs that perhaps she is not managing as well as she thought, the way her hand shakes when she pours coffee, the way she snaps at the children over minor infractions, the way she forgets things, simple things, things she used to remember without effort, the way she feels, increasingly, like she is watching herself from a distance, observing her own life as if it were happening to someone else, unable to fully inhabit her own body, unable to fully feel her own feelings. And beneath all of this, there is fear, a deep and growing fear that she is losing control, that the carefully constructed facade is crumbling, that soon everyone will see what she has been hiding, that she is not capable, not competent, not the perfect housewife she has been pretending to be. When this fear becomes too much, when the anxiety spills over into panic, when the tears come and cannot be stopped, she returns to the doctor, to the kind man in the white coat who listens patiently as she describes her symptoms, her nervousness, her inability to sleep, her sense of being overwhelmed. And he nods, and he makes notes on her chart, and he reaches for his prescription pad once more. But this time, the prescription is different. This time, it is not for energy, but for calm, not for stimulation, but for sedation, not amphetamines, but tranquilizers, the other half of the chemical equation, the yin to the previous yang, the solution to the problem created by the previous solution. And so she begins a new routine, a new rhythm, taking pills in the morning to wake up, to get going, to face the day, and taking pills in the evening to slow down, to relax, to finally, mercifully find sleep. She becomes a woman divided, a woman split between two chemical states, neither of them quite natural, neither of them quite her own, both of them necessary to maintain the illusion, to keep the performance going, to continue being the woman that everyone expects her to be. And she tells herself that this is fine, that this is simply how modern life works, that this is the price of progress, of convenience, of the suburban dream that promised so much and delivered, in the end, something far more complicated and far more costly than anyone had anticipated. The neighborhood continues around her, continues its own performance of perfection, and she is part of it, one player among many in this elaborate charade. The lawns remain immaculate, the houses remain spotless, the children remain well-dressed and well-behaved, and the women remain smiling, energetic, capable, at least on the surface, at least when anyone is watching. But in the medicine cabinets, in the drawers beside the bed, in the purses carried to the grocery store and the pharmacy and the PTA meeting, there are bottles, so many bottles. Bottles of pills in different shapes and colors, bottles with labels that promise help, that promise relief, that promise an answer to problems that no one is quite willing to name aloud. The social fabric of suburbia is woven through with these shared secrets, these common dependencies, these mutual pretenses. The women gather at book clubs and coffee clatches and Tupperware parties, and they talk about recipes and children and husbands and home decoration. And underneath all of that, there is the unspoken knowledge that they are all struggling, all coping in similar ways, all relying on similar crutches. There is comfort in this, a sense of solidarity that comes from knowing you are not alone, even if the knowledge is never explicitly acknowledged, even if the conversation never quite touches on the truth directly. They exchange knowing glances, they make oblique references, they share the names of sympathetic doctors and understanding pharmacists, And in this way, they support each other, they sustain each other, they help each other maintain the illusion that everything is under control. The cost of this illusion, however, continues to accumulate, continues to compound, continues to manifest in ways that are impossible to ignore forever. The physical toll of constant amphetamine use becomes evident in the tremors, the rapid heartbeat, the weight loss that is praised by some but worrying to others, the inability to sit still, the constant restless movement that never quite achieves anything productive but cannot be stopped. The emotional toll becomes evident in the mood swings, the sudden outbursts of anger or tears, the sense of disconnection from one's own life, the feeling of going through the motions without truly experiencing anything, without truly feeling anything beyond the artificial highs and lows induced by the medications. And yet, the alternative seems impossible, unthinkable, too dangerous to contemplate. To stop taking the pills would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that the standards are too high, the expectations too great, the whole enterprise fundamentally flawed. It would be to risk falling behind, to risk being judged, to risk losing one's place in the carefully ordered hierarchy of suburban life. And so the women continue taking the pills, continue pushing themselves beyond their natural limits, continue sacrificing their own health and well-being for the sake of maintaining appearances, for the sake of living up to an ideal that was never realistic in the first place, for the sake of fulfilling a role that was designed without any real consideration for the humanity of the women expected to perform it. The children growing up in these households absorb the lessons without fully understanding them, without being able to articulate what they are witnessing. They see their mothers as perpetual motion machines, always busy, always active, always doing something, never resting, never admitting fatigue or difficulty. They learn that this is normal, that this is what mothers do, that women are simply capable of endless productivity, endless patience, endless care. They do not see the pills, or if they do not understand their significance. They do not see the tears shed in private, or if they sense their mother's distress, they do not know how to name it or address it. They grow up with a distorted understanding of what is possible, what is healthy, what is sustainable, and they carry these lessons into their own adult lives, perpetuating the cycle, passing on the dysfunction to the next generation. The husbands, for their part, remain largely oblivious, or, if not oblivious, then willfully ignorant, choosing not to look too closely, choosing not to ask difficult questions, choosing to accept the smooth functioning of their households as a given, as something they have earned through their own labor in the outside world, as something owed to them rather than something achieved through immense and unsustainable effort on the part of their wives. They notice when dinner is late, when the house is not quite as tidy as usual, when their wives seem irritable or distant, but they do not connect these observations to any deeper understanding, do not recognize the signs of stress or exhaustion or chemical dependency. They offer vague reassurances, they suggest rest or relaxation, they perhaps bring home flowers or compliments, small gestures that are meant to help but that fundamentally miss the point, that fail to address the underlying problem, that allow the system to continue unchanged. The medical establishment, too, bears responsibility for this situation, for the casual prescribing of powerful stimulants and sedatives without adequate explanation of risks or side effects, without sufficient follow-up or monitoring, without any real consideration of whether there might be better solutions to the problems these women are facing. The doctors are trained to treat symptoms, to provide chemical solutions to what are essentially social and structural problems. And they do so with the best of intentions, but with a profound lack of understanding of the broader context, of the ways in which their prescriptions are contributing to a culture of dependency, to a system that requires women to chemically alter themselves in order to meet impossible standards. And the pharmaceutical companies, of course, profit enormously from all of this, from the vast market of tired, anxious, overwhelmed women who turn to medication for help, who believe the advertisements that promise easy solutions, who trust their doctors and their culture to guide them toward health and happiness. The companies produce the pills in staggering quantities. They fund the research that emphasizes benefits while downplaying risks. They advertise aggressively in medical journals and women's magazines. They cultivate relationships with doctors and pharmacists. They do everything in their power to ensure that their products remain the first line of defense against the pressures of modern life. Even as the evidence of harm begins to accumulate, even as individual stories of addiction and adverse effects begin to emerge, even as it becomes increasingly clear that the solution they are selling is creating as many problems as it solves. The 1950s stretch on year after year, and the pattern continues to repeat itself in household after household, neighborhood after neighborhood, across the entire sprawling landscape of post-war American suburbia. The houses multiply, the lawns spread, the schools fill with children, and beneath it all, the women continue their invisible labor, continue their chemical-assisted performances, continue to hold everything together with a combination of willpower, prescription medication, and the stubborn refusal to admit that the burden they are carrying is too heavy. The pace they are maintaining is too fast, the standards they are trying to meet are too high. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things begin to change. The cracks in the facade begin to show. The stories begin to circulate, whispered at first, then spoken aloud. Stories of women who collapsed, who broke down, who were hospitalized, who admitted to addiction, who confessed their struggles and found, to their surprise, that they were not alone, that others had experienced the same thing, that the problem was not individual weakness, but systemic dysfunction. The culture begins, very slowly, to shift, to question the assumptions that have governed women's lives, to challenge the expectations that have been taken for granted, to recognize that something is wrong, deeply wrong, with a society that requires its women to drug themselves into compliance with impossible standards. This shift does not happen quickly, does not happen easily, does not happen without resistance and backlash, and the desperate efforts of those invested in maintaining the status quo. But it happens, gradually, over years and decades, as women begin to speak out, begin to organize, begin to demand something different, something better, something more humane. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s has many roots, many causes, many sparks that ignite the fire. But surely one of them is this: the accumulated exhaustion and frustration of a generation of women who were told they could have it all, who were promised that modern convenience and modern medicine would make their lives easier, who discovered instead that they were trapped in a prison of their own making, a prison built from expectations and appearances and little white pills that promised help but delivered only dependency. Looking back now from the vantage point of many decades later, it is easy to see the absurdity of it all, easy to recognize the dysfunction, easy to judge the doctors who prescribed so carelessly, and the culture that demanded so much, and the women who went along with it all, who accepted the pills and the pressure and the impossible standards. But it is important, too, to see the courage, the resilience, the quiet heroism of these women who did what they thought they had to do, who made the best choices they could with the information and options available to them, who held their families and their communities together under conditions that we would now recognize as intolerable, who survived and persevered even when the cost was high, even when the burden was crushing, even when every day felt like a battle just to keep going. The legacy of the 1950s housewife, of the woman who relied on amphetamines to meet impossible standards, is complicated and multifaceted. On one hand, it is a cautionary tale about the dangers of chemical solutions to social problems, about the ways in which medical authority can be misused, about the costs of pursuing perfection at any price. On the other hand, it is a testament to human endurance, to the capacity of people to adapt and survive even in dysfunctional systems, to the strength of women who had few choices but made the most of the choices they had. It is a reminder that progress is not linear, that the past is not simply a series of mistakes to be corrected, but a complex tapestry of choices and constraints, of agency and oppression, of suffering and resilience, all woven together. As we drift through this story, as we imagine ourselves in those pastel-colored kitchens, as we feel the hum of the washing machine and smell the coffee percolating and hear the children playing in the yard, we are invited to feel compassion, to feel understanding, to recognize that the women of that era were not so different from us, that they wanted the same things we want, happiness and security and purpose and recognition, and that they were caught in a system that made those things contingent on maintaining an impossible facade, on meeting standards that no human being could meet without help, without chemical assistance, without paying a price that should never have been asked of them. And so, as this long night continues, as we explore every corner of this story, every aspect of this hidden history, we carry with us not judgment but empathy, not condemnation but curiosity, not pity but respect for the women who lived through this era, who survived it, who eventually helped to change it, who paved the way for different possibilities, different choices, different understandings of what it means to be a woman, a wife, a mother, a human being trying to navigate the demands of daily life without losing oneself in the process. The 1950s eventually gave way to the 1960s, and the culture began to shift, began to question, began to challenge the assumptions that had governed the previous decade. The women who had spent their youth and their energy maintaining perfect homes and perfect appearances began to ask whether perfection was worth the cost, began to demand recognition for their labor, began to insist that there must be other ways to live, other ways to organize family life, other ways to define success and fulfillment. The pills did not disappear, the pressure did not vanish overnight, but the conversation changed, the possibilities expanded, and slowly, painfully, a new understanding began to emerge, an understanding that women were not machines, that they could not be expected to function endlessly without rest or support, that chemical solutions were not the answer to problems rooted in social structures and cultural expectations. This understanding continues to evolve, continues to deepen, continues to shape the way we think about work and family, about gender and responsibility, about health and well-being. We have not solved all the problems, we have not eliminated all the pressures, we have not achieved anything close to true equality or true balance, but we have learned, painfully and slowly, some of the lessons of the 1950s, some of the truths about what happens when we ask too much of people, when we offer chemical solutions to human problems, when we prioritize appearance over authenticity, perfection over health, productivity over well-being. And as we lie here in the quiet darkness, as we allow this story to wash over us, as we drift towards sleep with images of pastel kitchens and immaculate lawns and tired women taking their morning pills, we carry with us a deeper understanding of where we have been, of what has been sacrificed, of what has been learned. We carry with us gratitude for the women who came before, who endured what they endured, who eventually found the courage to say that something was wrong, that change was necessary, that there had to be a better way. We carry with us awareness of the ways in which their struggles continue to echo in our own lives, in the pressures we still feel, in the expectations we still face, in the temptation to seek chemical solutions to problems that are fundamentally about how we organize our lives, how we structure our societies, how we value different kinds of work and different kinds of contributions. The story of the 1950s housewife and her amphetamines is not just a story about the past, it is a story that continues to resonate, continues to teach, continues to challenge us to think differently about gender and work, about health and medication, about perfection and authenticity, about the costs we are willing to pay, and the costs we ask others to pay in pursuit of our ideals and our aspirations. It is a story that reminds us to look beneath the surface, to question the narratives we are told, to pay attention to the hidden costs and the unspoken sacrifices, to listen to the voices that have been silenced or marginalized, to honor the experiences of those who came before, and to learn from their struggles as we navigate our own. And so, as this journey through the 1950s comes to its close, as the images begin to fade and the voices begin to quiet, and sleep begins to pull us gently down into its embrace, we take with us not just information, but understanding, not just facts, but empathy, not just history, but wisdom. We take with us the knowledge that behind every era's facade of perfection lies a more complex reality, that behind every smiling face in a magazine advertisement lies a human being with struggles and sorrows and strengths that are never fully visible, never fully acknowledged, never fully honored in the stories we tell about the past. Rest now, and let these stories settle into your consciousness. Let them inform your understanding. Let them deepen your compassion. Rest now knowing that the women of the 1950s, with all their struggles and their resilience, with all their dependencies and their endurance, with all their secrets and their strengths, have left us a legacy that is worth remembering, worth honoring, worth learning from. Rest now and carry their stories with you into your dreams, into your waking life, into your own ongoing journey toward understanding and authenticity, and a way of living that honors both the demands of the world and the needs of the human soul. The night deepens, the story ends, but the echoes continue to reverberate through time, continue to shape our present and our future, continue to remind us that history is not just something that happened long ago, but something that lives on in the choices we make, in the questions we ask, in the compassion we extend to those who came before and those who will come after. Sleep well, and remember always that beneath the surface of every era, every culture, every carefully constructed facade, there are human beings trying their best to survive, to thrive, to find meaning and purpose and joy, and that their stories, however difficult, however painful, however complicated, are worth telling, worth hearing, worth carrying forward into whatever future we are building together. The kitchen appliances of the 1950s deserve their own consideration, their own chapter in this story, because they are not merely background details, but central characters in the drama of suburban life, symbols of progress and modernity that carried their own hidden costs, their own false promises. The advertisements showed smiling women effortlessly operating these mechanical marvels, pushing a button and watching their work disappear, their time freed up for leisure and family and personal fulfillment. But the reality, as always, was more complicated, more demanding, more exhausting than the advertisements suggested. Consider the automatic washing machine, that hulking white beast that sat in the basement or the utility room, promising to revolutionize the endless cycle of laundry that had consumed women's time and energy for generations. The advertisements called it a miracle, a liberation, an emancipation from drudgery. But what the advertisements did not mention was that the automatic washing machine, by making it easier to wash clothes, also raised the standards for cleanliness, increased the frequency of washing, and created new expectations about how often sheets should be changed, how quickly a stained shirt should be laundered, how spotless every garment should be before it was worn again. The machine did not reduce the work, it transformed it, made it more frequent, more demanding, more subject to scrutiny and judgment. The woman who owned an automatic washing machine in the 1950s found herself washing clothes more often than her mother had, not less. She washed the sheets twice a week instead of once. She washed the children's play clothes daily instead of letting them wear the same outfit for several days. She washed the kitchen towels after every use, the bathroom towels after every shower, the handkerchiefs after a single sneeze. The machine made all of this possible, made it easy, but easy and less are not the same thing. And the woman who stood in her utility room sorting endless piles of laundry, loading and unloading the machine multiple times a day, treating stains and checking for shrinkage, and refolding items that had been folded wrong, this woman was not experiencing liberation, but a new and more intensive form of domestic labor, one that required constant vigilance, constant effort, constant chemical assistance to maintain the pace. And the washing machine itself was not always reliable, not always cooperative. It shook violently during the spin cycle, threatening to walk across the floor if not properly balanced. It flooded the floor when the hoses came loose or the drain clogged. It tangled clothes into impossible knots, stretched elastic, faded colors, shrank wool sweaters into doll-sized curiosities. It required maintenance, required understanding of its moods and mechanisms, required the kind of attention and care that might have been lavished on a temperamental pet or a difficult child. And when it broke down, as machines inevitably do, the woman was left not with a liberation, but with a crisis, a mountain of unwashed clothes and no easy way to manage them, forced to haul everything to the laundromat or wash by hand in the bathtub, discovering in that moment that the machine had not freed her, but made her dependent, vulnerable, unable to function without the technology she had been told would make her life easier. The kitchen itself, with its gleaming chrome and colorful formica, its matching appliances and coordinated color schemes, was both showcase and prison, both source of pride and site of endless labor. The electric stove required constant cleaning to maintain its shine, the burner pans accumulating grease and grime that had to be scrubbed away with steel wool and harsh cleansers that left the woman's hands red and raw. The refrigerator needed defrosting regularly, a process that involved emptying all the contents, turning off the machine, waiting for the ice to melt, catching the water in pans and towels, scraping stubborn ice from the freezer compartment, cleaning the interior with baking soda solution, and then restocking everything, a task that consumed an entire afternoon and left puddles on the floor and the nagging worry that something would spoil before it could be returned to proper refrigeration. The dishwasher, when a household was fortunate enough to have one, promised to eliminate the nightly ritual of washing dishes by hand, standing at the sink with aching feet and pruned fingers, scrubbing plates and glasses and pots and pans until everything was clean and dry and put away. But the dishwasher had its own demands, its own requirements. The dishes had its own requirements. The dishes had to be rinsed before loading, otherwise food particles would clog the mechanism. They had to be arranged in precise patterns to ensure proper cleaning, large plates in the back, smaller plates in front, glasses on the top rack secured so they would not tip and fill with dirty water, silverware in the basket with handles down or handles up depending on which expert opinion you followed. The detergent had to be measured carefully, not too much or it would leave spots, not too little or nothing would come clean. And even after the cycle completed, the dishes emerged hot and wet, requiring careful handling and air drying before they could be put away, a process that sometimes took as long as washing by hand would have taken in the first place. The vacuum cleaner, that other essential appliance of modern homemaking, was advertised as the answer to dust and dirt, the tool that would keep floors and carpets pristine with minimal effort. But the vacuum of the 1950s was heavy, awkward, difficult to maneuver. It had to be dragged from room to room, the cord constantly tangling or unplugging at inconvenient moments, the attachments always falling off or getting lost or clogging with hair and lint. It roared like an airplane engine, drowning out all other sound, making it impossible to hear the telephone or the doorbell or a child calling from another room. It stirred up dust even as it removed it, leaving the woman who operated it sneezing and coughing, her eyes watering, her sinuses inflamed. And it required constant maintenance, emptying the bag when it filled with dust and debris, changing the belt when it wore out, unclogging the hose when something too large got sucked up and blocked the airflow. These machines, these symbols of progress and modernity, did change domestic life, did alter the nature of housework, but they did not liberate women from labor as promised. Instead, they intensified it, increased the standards, raised the expectations, created new forms of work to replace the old ones. And they required energy to operate, not just electrical energy, but human energy, the energy to keep moving, to keep working, to keep maintaining the machines and meeting the standards they made possible. This is where the amphetamines came in, filling the gap between what the machines promised and what they delivered, providing the chemical boost necessary to keep pace with the demands of modern life. To be the kind of woman who could effortlessly operate all these appliances, maintain all these standards, and still have energy left over to be charming and attractive and available to her husband and children. The relationship between technology and chemistry in 1950s suburbia was symbiotic, each one enabling the other, each one making the other necessary. The machines made it possible to achieve higher standards of cleanliness and order, but only if the woman had the energy and focus to operate them constantly. The pills made it possible to maintain that energy and focus, but only because the machines had raised the standards to a level that required chemical assistance. Together, they created a system that appeared efficient and modern from the outside, but that extracted a terrible cost from the women trapped within it. Women who found themselves dependent on both the machines and the medications, unable to function without either one, caught in a cycle of technological and pharmaceutical dependency that would take decades to recognize and begin to address. The children growing up in these households absorbed lessons about technology and progress that would shape their own relationship to machines and work and domestic life. They learned that housework should be easy because there were machines to do it, and therefore, if their mother seemed tired or stressed or overwhelmed, it must be her fault, her failure, her inadequacy, rather than any flaw in the system itself. They learned that modern life required constant consumption, constant upgrading, constant acquisition of new appliances and new products, and new solutions to problems they had not known existed until the advertisements told them about it. They learned that there was always a technological fix, always a chemical solution, always a way to override the body's natural limits and keep pushing, keep striving, keep achieving more and more and more without ever stopping to question whether more was actually better, whether progress was actually progressive, whether the costs were worth the benefits. The advertising industry understood all of this, understood the anxieties and aspirations of suburban housewives, understood the pressure they felt and the standards they were trying to meet, and crafted messages specifically designed to exploit those vulnerabilities, to create new needs and new insecurities, to position their products as essential solutions to problems that often the advertisements themselves had created. The woman reading a magazine in 1957 would encounter dozens of advertisements in a single issue, each one showing her something she did not have, some way in which her home or her appearance or her family life fell short of the ideal, some product that promised to close the gap between her reality and the perfect world depicted in the glossy pages. There were advertisements for cleaning products that promised to make floors shine like mirrors, to make windows sparkle like crystal, to make bathrooms gleam like surgical theaters. There were advertisements for food products that promised to make meal preparation faster and easier, instant puddings and cake mixes and frozen vegetables and canned soups that could be transformed into complete dinners with minimal effort. There were advertisements for beauty products that promised to make women look younger, thinner, more attractive, more desirable, with creams and lotions and makeup and hair products that would erase every flaw and highlight every asset. And interspersed among all of these were the advertisements for medications, for vitamins and supplements and diet pills and nerve tonics, products that promised to provide energy when you were tired, calm when you were anxious, sleep when you were restless, appetite control when you were hungry, relief from every symptom and solution to every problem. The cumulative effect of all this advertising was to create a sense of inadequacy, a feeling that nothing was ever quite good enough, that there was always room for improvement, always another product to buy, always another standard to meet. The woman who read these magazines and watched these television commercials absorbed the message that her worth was measured by her ability to maintain a perfect home, raise perfect children, and remain perfectly attractive to her husband, and that all of this was achievable, was expected, was simply what modern women did, with the help of the right products and the right medications and the right attitude. Failure to achieve these standards was presented not as a reasonable response to unreasonable expectations, but as a personal failing, a lack of effort or intelligence or character that could and should be corrected. This is the context in which the amphetamine epidemic of the 1950s must be understood, not as a simple story of medical malpractice or corporate greed, though both of those elements were certainly present, but as a complex interaction of technology, culture, gender expectations, and economic interests, all coming together to create a situation in which millions of women felt they had no choice but to medicate themselves into compliance with standards they had not chosen and could not meet without chemical assistance. The pills were not imposed on unwilling victims, but sought out by desperate women who saw no other way to manage their lives, who believed the promises of the advertisements and the reassurances of their doctors, who wanted to be good wives and good mothers and good housewives, and who had been taught that goodness in these roles required a level of productivity and perfection that was simply not humanly sustainable. And for a while, for a few years or perhaps even a decade, the system seemed to work, seemed to deliver on its promises. The suburbs expanded, the economy grew, families prospered, and the women who powered it all with their labor and their medications kept everything running smoothly, kept up appearances, kept the secret of their dependency hidden behind closed doors and knowing glances and discreet conversations with sympathetic doctors. But systems that are not sustainable eventually break down. Cracks eventually appear, and the facade of perfection that the 1950s worked so hard to maintain eventually began to crumble, revealing the human cost that had been hidden underneath all along. The breaking point came in different ways for different women, at different times, in different circumstances. But it came eventually for nearly all of them. For some, it was a physical collapse, the body simply refusing to continue, shutting down in protest against the constant chemical stimulation and the endless demands. Heart palpitations, severe anxiety, insomnia so profound that days blurred into nights without any rest at all, weight loss that went from flattering to alarming, tremors that made it difficult to hold a coffee cup or write a check or apply lipstick with a steady hand. The body has limits, and those limits cannot be overridden indefinitely, no matter how many pills are taken, no matter how strong the determination to keep going. For others, the breaking point was emotional or psychological, a moment when the gap between the performance and the reality became too wide to bridge, when the exhaustion and the fear and the sense of being trapped became overwhelming. When the tears came and could not be stopped, when the anger erupted in ways that could not be controlled or explained away. These were the women who had what the 1950s called nervous breakdowns, who collapsed not physically but mentally, who found themselves unable to continue playing the role they had been assigned, unable to maintain the facade, unable to pretend that everything was fine when nothing was fine, when in fact everything was falling apart and had been falling apart for a long time, but no one had wanted to see it or acknowledge it or do anything about it. The medical response to these breakdowns was predictable. More medication, different medication, tranquilizers to calm the nerves that the amphetamines had frayed, sedatives to provide the sleep that the stimulants had stolen, a whole new category of prescriptions designed to manage the side effects of the previous prescriptions, creating a pharmaceutical merry-go-round that was easier to get on than to get off, that trapped women in cycles of dependency that would take years to escape, if they ever escaped at all. The doctors who prescribed these medications saw themselves as helping, as providing compassionate care to suffering patients, and in some sense they were. They were offering the only solutions they knew, the only tools their training had given them. But they were also perpetuating a system that created the suffering in the first place, that made women sick and then treated the symptoms without ever addressing the causes, without ever questioning whether the problem might be the expectations rather than the women's inability to meet them. The pharmaceutical companies, meanwhile, continued to profit, continued to develop new formulations and new marketing strategies, continued to position their products as essential tools for modern living. They funded research that emphasized the safety and efficacy of their drugs while downplaying the risks and side effects. They cultivated relationships with doctors, providing free samples and glossy brochures and invitations to conferences where the latest products were presented with scientific authority and marketing polish. They advertised directly to consumers in magazines and on television, creating demand that doctors then felt obligated to meet, creating a culture in which medication was the first line of defense against any and every problem, in which chemical solutions were always preferable to social or structural changes that might actually address the root causes of distress. Looking back at the 1950s from our current vantage point, it is easy to see how wrong this all was, how misguided, how harmful. It is easy to judge the doctors who prescribed so carelessly, the pharmaceutical companies that marketed so aggressively, the culture that demanded so much and provided so little support. But it is important to remember that the people living through that era did not have the benefit of hindsight, did not know what we know now about addiction and dependency and the long-term effects of chronic stimulant use. They were making decisions with the information available to them, operating within the constraints and assumptions of their time, doing what they thought was right, or at least what they thought was necessary. And it is important, too, to recognize that while the specific details have changed, while we no longer routinely prescribe amphetamines to tired housewives, the underlying dynamics have not disappeared. The pressures and expectations placed on women have not vanished. The search for chemical solutions to social problems continues in different forms. Today's tired mothers may not reach for Benzedrine, but they reach for other things: caffeine in ever larger doses, prescription medications for anxiety and depression, over-the-counter supplements promising energy and focus, perhaps other substances, legal or otherwise, that help them manage the impossible juggling act of work and family and all the other demands that modern life places on them. The specifics change, but the pattern persists. The expectation that women will somehow manage it all, will somehow be everything to everyone, will somehow maintain impossible standards without adequate support or resources, or even acknowledgement of the difficulty of what they are being asked to do. The legacy of the 1950s housewife and her amphetamines is not just a historical curiosity, not just a quirky detail from a bygone era, but a warning, a reminder, a call to pay attention to the ways in which our own society creates pressures and then offers chemical solutions, the ways in which we ask too much of people and then blame them when they struggle, the ways in which we medicalize social problems and individual suffering rather than addressing the structures and systems that create that suffering in the first place. The women of the 1950s were not weak or foolish or morally deficient. They were human beings trapped in a system that was designed to extract maximum labor from them while providing minimum support. And they did what they had to do to survive, to meet the expectations placed upon them, to care for their families and maintain their homes, and preserve their dignity and sense of self-worth in circumstances that made all of that extraordinarily difficult. The slow recognition of the problem, the gradual shift in understanding that began in the 1960s and continued through the 70s and beyond, did not happen automatically or inevitably. It happened because women began to speak out, began to share their stories, began to organize and demand change. The women's liberation movement, with all its complexity and internal debates and multiple strands of activism and analysis, was fueled in part by the accumulated frustration and exhaustion of women who had spent the 1950s trying to be perfect, trying to meet impossible standards, trying to maintain appearances at tremendous personal cost. When Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, giving voice to what she called the problem that has no name, the widespread dissatisfaction and unhappiness of educated middle-class housewives who had everything they were supposed to want but still felt empty and unfulfilled, she was articulating something that many women had felt but not known how to express, something that had been hidden behind the facade of suburban perfection, something that the amphetamines had helped to suppress but could not ultimately eliminate. The consciousness-raising groups of the late 1960s and early 70s provided spaces where women could talk honestly about their experiences, could share the secrets they had been keeping, could discover that they were not alone in their struggles, that the problem was not individual inadequacy but systemic oppression, that the personal was indeed political. In these conversations, the topic of medication often came up. Women sharing their histories of prescription drug use, discovering that many of them had been given the same pills for the same reasons, beginning to question whether the problem was really their own nervousness or inadequacy, or whether it was the expectations and demands that had been placed upon them. This questioning, this collective realization that something was deeply wrong with the way women's lives were structured and the way women's suffering was medicalized, was a crucial step in the broader feminist awakening of that era, and it had lasting effects on medical practice, on cultural attitudes, on the way we think about gender and work and family and health. But change is slow, and progress is never linear, and many of the issues that the women's movement identified and challenged in the 1960s and 70s persist in different forms today. Women are still expected to manage the majority of domestic labor even when they work full-time outside the home. They are still judged more harshly than men for any failure to maintain perfect homes or raise perfect children. They are still offered chemical solutions, therapeutic interventions, individual fixes to what are fundamentally social and structural problems. The specific medications have changed, the cultural context has shifted, but the underlying dynamic remains remarkably similar. The expectation that women will somehow do it all, be it all, manage it all, without complaint, without support, without ever acknowledging the impossibility of what is being asked of them. This is why the story of the 1950s housewife and her amphetamines matters, why it is worth telling and retelling, why it deserves to be remembered and understood not just as a historical curiosity, but as a warning and a lesson. It shows us what happens when a society creates impossible standards and then pathologizes the people who struggle to meet them. It shows us the dangers of looking for chemical solutions to social problems. It shows us the importance of questioning the narratives we are told about success and happiness and fulfillment, of paying attention to the costs hidden beneath the surface, of listening to the voices of those who are suffering, even when that suffering is wrapped in smiles and starched aprons and carefully maintained appearances. As we drift through this history, as we allow ourselves to feel the exhaustion and the anxiety and the quiet desperation of these women, we are invited to reflect on our own moment, our own pressures, our own searches for solutions to problems that perhaps should not exist in the first place. We are invited to ask what standards we are trying to meet and whether those standards are reasonable, what costs we are paying and whether those costs are worth it, what chemical or technological or therapeutic solutions we are reaching for, and whether they are addressing the real problem or merely masking the symptoms. We are invited to extend compassion, both to the women of the past who did what they thought they had to do, and to ourselves and each other in the present as we navigate our own versions of these challenges, our own attempts to balance competing demands, our own struggles to be enough in a world that always seems to want more. The night continues to deepen, and the story continues to unfold, layer upon layer of complexity and contradiction, of suffering and resilience, of oppression and resistance. The 1950s housewife with her bottle of pills and her immaculate kitchen and her permanent smile becomes not just a historical figure, but a symbol, a representation of something larger, something that extends beyond one decade or one country or one particular set of circumstances. She represents the human cost of perfection, the price paid when appearance matters more than authenticity, when productivity matters more than well-being, when meeting external standards matters more than honoring internal needs and limits. And as we finally allow ourselves to rest, to let go of the story and drift into sleep, we carry with us not just information about the past, but insight into the present. Not just facts about amphetamines and suburbia, but understanding about the human condition, about the ways we cope with pressure, about the ways we survive systems that are designed without sufficient regard for human limitations and human needs. We carry with us compassion for those who came before, gratitude for the changes they helped to bring about, and awareness of the work that still remains, the questions that still need asking, the structures that still need changing, the conversations that still need having. Sleep now and let these stories settle into your consciousness. Let them become part of the way you understand the world, the way you understand history, the way you understand yourself and others. Sleep now, knowing that every era has its hidden costs, its buried secrets, its stories that need telling, and that by listening to these stories, by allowing ourselves to feel what the people who lived them felt, we become more aware, more compassionate, more capable of creating different futures, better futures, futures in which people are not asked to chemically alter themselves to meet impossible standards, in which support is provided rather than mere medication, in which the goal is not perfection, but authenticity, not endless productivity, but sustainable balance, not appearances, but genuine well-being. The women of the 1950s could not have imagined the world we live in now, with all its changes and all its continuities, with all the progress that has been made and all the problems that persist. But they would recognize, I think, the fundamental struggles, the pressure to do more with less, the expectation that we will somehow manage it all, the temptation to reach for quick fixes and chemical solutions rather than demanding systemic change. Their story is our story, separated by time but connected by the common threads of human experience, human limitation, human resilience. And in remembering them, in honoring their struggles and their strength, we remember and honor something in ourselves, some shared humanity that transcends the particularities of any one era or circumstance. Rest now, and carry these truths with you into your dreams and your waking hours. Rest now, and remember that behind every era's myths of perfection lie real human beings with real struggles, and that their stories matter, their experiences matter, their lives matter, not just as history, but as ongoing testament to the capacity of human beings to endure, to survive, to eventually demand and create something better. The night is deep, the story is complete, and sleep is waiting to embrace you with gentle arms, offering the rest that the women of the 1950s so rarely found, the peace that they deserved but were so seldom granted, the restoration that every human being needs and that no pill can truly provide. Good night, and may your rest be deep and dreamless, untroubled by the ghosts of impossible standards, free from the pressure to be anything other than fully, imperfectly, beautifully human. Hello, my dear friends. Welcome back to another journey through the shadows of history, where beauty and decay danced together beneath chandeliers of impossible light. Tonight, we step through the gilded gates of Versailles, that monument to splendor, that palace of mirrors where everything glittered and nothing was quite as it seemed. If you enjoy drifting through these hidden corners of the past, where truth wears perfume and elegance hides suffering, consider joining us for more tales that carry you gently into sleep. Now, settle into your pillows, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a soft fan for that soothing background hum, and let us begin this slow descent into a world that looked like heaven, but smelled of something else entirely. They looked like goddesses, draped in silks that whispered with every movement, their faces powdered to porcelain perfection, their hair piled high in towers of curls and ribbons. But beneath the surface, beneath the layers of lace and the clouds of perfume, there existed a world that never truly washed. A palace where women cleaned their faces with water already used by men to shave and spit, where they perfumed their decay and called the stench refinement, where the silk gowns and the candles and the laughter all shimmered above layers of filth and denial. What passed for beauty was built on the quiet suffering of bodies that were not allowed to breathe, to bleed, or to smell like life itself. Tonight, we step through the perfume and into the truth, the disgusting hygiene habits of Versailles women, told not with shock or scandal, but with the slow, gentle voice of history, the kind that lulls you toward sleep even as it reveals what was hidden. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders fall, and allow yourself to drift between the then and the now, between the glitter and the rot, between what they showed the world and what they hid behind closed doors. If one were to enter the private chambers of a Versailles lady at dawn, the first thing to notice would be the quiet clinking of silver basins being carried in by servants whose footsteps barely made a sound on the cold marble floors. The air would still be cool, filled with the faint odor of perfume and candle wax that had settled overnight like a second skin on every surface. A maid would kneel beside a gilded stand, her hands moving with practiced precision as she poured water from a porcelain jug into a shallow bowl that caught the early light and made it dance. To an outsider, it might seem like a graceful ritual of morning cleansing, a gentle awakening of beauty. Yet few would guess that the water swirling in that elegant basin, that water reflecting the soft glow of dawn, had already been used moments earlier by a nobleman shaving his beard or clearing his throat into it, perhaps rinsing the sleep from his eyes or washing the powder from his hands. This was no mistake, no accident of careless servants. It was custom, woven into the fabric of palace life as tightly as the golden threads in the tapestries. The discarded water from the gentlemen's chambers was collected with care, carried up marble staircases by servants who had learned not to wrinkle their noses, and offered to the ladies of the court as if it were precious, as if it carried some invisible blessing. To them, it was not waste, but refinement, not something used, but something enhanced. They believed that the faint scent of a man's cologne mixed with the trace of his skin lent a mysterious charm to the complexion, that it carried with it some essence of masculinity that would make their own beauty more complete, more balanced, more elegant in ways that fresh water never could. It is almost comical when you think about it, almost absurd enough to laugh, that the women of the most polished court in Europe, the very center of civilization and culture, willingly dabbed their faces with the very water men had spat in, had rinsed their razors in, had used to wash away the grime of the previous night. The maids moved in silence, trained from childhood not to reveal disgust, not to let their faces betray what their noses knew. A few petals would be dropped into the bowl before it was presented, rose petals mostly, or jasmine when it was in season, sometimes orange blossom to add a note of brightness. All carefully chosen to hide the unpleasant odor that lingered faintly beneath the perfume, like a secret whispered too softly to hear, but impossible to forget. The noblewoman would then lift a lace cloth, something delicate and embroidered, something that cost more than a servant earned in a year, and dip it into the water with a motion so practiced it seemed like prayer. She would gently pat her cheeks, her forehead, the sides of her nose, each touch deliberate and light, as though the water itself were holy. Her reflection in the mirror would shimmer in the candlelight, the soft touch of contaminated water gliding across powdered skin that had not been truly clean in weeks, perhaps months. The room smelled of sweet decay, like flowers rotting under silk, like something beautiful that had been left too long in the sun. But in Versailles, scent was everything, and to smell of a man, even indirectly, even through his discarded bathwater, was to smell of privilege, of access, of belonging to a world where even waste was gilded. The servants, who knew the truth of where the water came from, who had seen the basins collected from the men's rooms with their cloudy contents and faint films of saliva floating on the surface, kept their eyes low and their mouths closed. They had seen things that would make others recoil, but their duty was to deliver, not to judge, not to question the logic of a world that had long ago replaced reason with ritual. In the court's strange hierarchy of hygiene, the act of washing was less about cleanliness and more about imitation, about following the patterns set by those above you, about proving that you understood the unspoken rules of refinement. The king's habits dictated the behavior of the entire palace, and if he preferred a certain lotion, others used it. If his barber's water was reused, so was everyone else's, cascading down through the ranks like a waterfall of habit and fear. Clean water was rare and precious in a palace that seemed to have everything. The fountains glittered outside in the gardens, their jets of water catching the sunlight and making rainbows in the air. But the pipes that carried water into the palace itself were unreliable, sometimes delivering more rust than purity, more sediment than clarity. To waste water was a sign of ignorance, of not understanding the delicate balance of resources that kept the palace functioning. To reuse it, especially water that had been touched by a nobleman, by someone whose rank made even their refuse valuable, was considered elegant restraint, a mark of sophistication that separated the refined from the crude. It is as absurd as if today someone bottled the water from a celebrity sink and sold it as skincare, marketed it as containing some essence of fame, some transferable quality that could be absorbed through the skin. Yet in Versailles, the illusion of refinement mattered more than hygiene, more than health, more than the whispered complaints of skin that burned and itched beneath the powder. The basins themselves were works of art, crafted from silver that had been polished until it reflected like water, or porcelain painted with scenes of pastoral beauty, their edges carved with cherubs whose fat cheeks and innocent eyes seemed to mock the practice they facilitated, decorated with gold leaves that caught the light and distracted from the contents they held. When the maid poured the reused water, she did so with a steady hand, her movements choreographed by years of service, ensuring the petals floated just right, arranging them so they covered the surface like a veil, like a lie made beautiful. The lady would hum softly as she cleansed, a melody half remembered from childhood, believing that this mixture, this blend of masculine essence and floral disguise, could preserve her youth, could keep her skin soft and her complexion clear in ways that ordinary water never could. Her face, pale and powdered, was the emblem of control and class, a canvas on which the rules of the court were painted fresh each morning. Dirt and decay could exist behind the curtain, in the servants' quarters, in the streets of Paris, but never on her skin, never where it could be seen or acknowledged or discussed. The ritual was a performance, a quiet theater of denial that took place every morning before the mirrors of Versailles, repeated in chamber after chamber as the sun rose higher and the palace slowly came to life. In the grand corridors, the smell of cologne mixed with the damp scent of old water, creating an atmosphere that was uniquely Versailles, a fragrance that visitors would remember long after they left, though they could never quite identify what made it so distinctive. It lingered on the hands of servants, on the towels hung to dry in the dim corners of dressing rooms, on the perfume bottles stacked near the mirrors like soldiers awaiting orders. None of this seemed strange to those who lived within the palace walls, those who had been born into this world or had spent enough years in it to forget what normal smelled like. They had learned to confuse fragrance with purity, to believe that if something smelled pleasant, it must therefore be clean, must therefore be acceptable. Even physicians of the time advised gentle washing with used water, writing in their leather-bound journals that it softened the skin, that harsh fresh water could shock the delicate balance of the complexion. It was less about science and more about social comfort, about finding medical justification for practices that had more to do with scarcity and status than with health. To reuse something from a man of status was to share in his aura, to absorb some invisible quality that fresh water, common and available to anyone, could never provide. To wash with plain, fresh water would have seemed almost crude, almost peasant-like, a confession that one did not understand the subtle arts of refinement. At night, when the long day of performances finally ended, the same ladies who had dabbed their faces with stale water in the morning attended glittering balls where candles blazed in chandeliers overhead and their cheeks glowed faintly under the flickering light. Compliments were exchanged on the smoothness of their skin, the delicate scent of their perfume, the luminous quality of their complexion that seemed almost otherworldly. No one spoke of the basins in the servants' corridors, lined up like soldiers at attention, filled with cloudy water waiting to be reused again tomorrow, the water that had become the foundation of their beauty. The truth was hidden beneath layers of powder and etiquette, buried so deep that even those who practiced these rituals might not have fully acknowledged what they were doing, might have convinced themselves that the story they told about masculine essence and refined practice was somehow true. What mattered was the image, and the image was everything in Versailles. Clean, radiant, and touched by nobility, these were the qualities that opened doors and secured positions, that made marriages and maintained power. I cannot help but feel uneasy imagining such beauty rituals carried out in rooms that smelled faintly of another person's morning breath, in chambers where the distinction between clean and dirty had been so thoroughly erased that even the servants sometimes forgot which was which. The ritual reflected a deeper reality about Versailles, a truth that extended far beyond the morning washing of faces. Cleanliness was a performance, not a condition, something one demonstrated rather than achieved. The palace itself was polished marble on the surface, its floors gleaming like mirrors, its walls covered in silk and gold leaf, but rotting beneath where the wood had begun to decay and the foundations were settling unevenly into the soft earth. The pipes leaked more often than they worked properly, the drains overflowed with regularity, and the gardens, those famous gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see, carried the stench of waste disguised by thousands of flowers planted specifically for that purpose. In this world, appearances ruled over sense, or rather, appearances included carefully curated scents that masked the reality beneath. A face washed in a man's leftovers could still be called pure as long as it looked pure, as long as the powder sat smooth and the rouge was applied with skill and the eyes sparkled with confidence rather than shame. The water shimmered in the light, catching the gold of the basin and the silver of the jug. The petals floated on the surface like promises, and the illusion remained intact, solid and unshakable, and essential to the functioning of the entire elaborate machine. They washed their faces not to remove dirt, but to replace it with a story of elegance, to exchange one kind of residue for another that came with a better narrative, a more acceptable origin. Beneath the fragrance and the flowers was a truth they never wished to touch, a reality of bodies and fluids and the basic functions of human life that had no place in the theater of Versailles. And perhaps that is what made Versailles both magnificent and monstrous, both awe-inspiring and horrifying, the fact that it could create beauty out of denial, could build an empire on the foundation of lies so polished they became indistinguishable from truth. They called it refinement, this practice of washing in used water, of dabbing contaminated liquid onto skin and calling it care. I call it decay wearing silk, corruption dressed in lace, the slow rot of a society that had convinced itself that appearances were not just important, but were in fact the only thing that mattered, the only reality worth acknowledging. Even now, centuries later, the thought lingers in the quiet spaces of the mind, unsettling and strange. What else did they reuse in the name of beauty? What other boundaries did they cross, believing it made them more divine, more removed from the common struggles of ordinary life, more worthy of the gold that surrounded them and the power they wielded? In the chambers of Versailles, everything glittered with an intensity that hurt the eyes if you looked too long. The gold-framed mirrors that lined the walls, reflecting light back and forth until the rooms seemed to contain their own small suns. The embroidered drapes that had taken years to create and cost fortunes to install. The marble floors polished to such a high shine that they became dangerous to walk on in anything but the softest shoes. Yet beneath all that beauty, beneath the surface that everyone admired and envied and tried to imitate, a strange contradiction thrived like mold in the darkness. Cleanliness was not a matter of health, not something pursued for the sake of the body or its comfort, but rather a matter of appearance, of maintaining the image that everything was as it should be, that the palace and everyone in it existed in a state of perpetual perfection. The women of the court learned to maintain this illusion with an elegance that defied logic, that required them to ignore the evidence of their own senses and trust instead in the collective delusion. After using their lavish commodes, those ornate chairs with velvet cushions and hidden chambers beneath, chairs that were themselves works of art decorated with gilt and carving, they did not wash with soap or reach for a towel dampened with clean water. Instead, they turned to a thick fur-covered rug lying gracefully beside the chair, placed there with apparent care, its position suggesting purpose rather than accident. It was soft to the touch, richly colored in deep reds and golds, decorated with threads of silver that caught the candlelight, threads that had been woven by craftsmen who had no idea what purpose their beautiful creation would serve. It was not placed there for comfort, nor as decoration to fill an empty space, but for wiping hands, for cleaning away what remained after the private act was completed. The same rug that brushed against their shoes as they walked, that collected dust from the floors and powder from their skirts, became the final step of their toilet ritual, the last point of contact before they returned to the world of appearances. The act was so ordinary within those walls, so completely normalized by repetition and acceptance, that no one even questioned it. No one thought to ask whether there might be a better way, a cleaner method, a practice that made more sense. It is almost absurd to imagine the women of the most dazzling palace in Europe, women whose portraits hung in galleries and whose names were known across the continent, wiping their hands on what was essentially a shared carpet, then standing up, adjusting their skirts, and calling it grace, calling it refinement, never acknowledging the contradiction between what they did and what they claimed to be. The rugs of Versailles were works of art in their own right, treasures that would have been the pride of any lesser household, often woven in the royal workshops of Aubusson, where master craftsmen spent months on a single piece, or imported from distant lands where the traditions of rug making stretched back centuries. Each one could take months to complete, sometimes years for the most elaborate designs, and they were symbols of wealth that spoke volumes about the status of their owners. They were covered with flowers rendered in such detail you could almost smell them, with mythological creatures frozen in eternal motion, with golden borders that framed the designs like the edges of paintings. Yet despite their beauty, despite the artistry and labor that had gone into their creation, they carried an invisible burden that no amount of skill could decorate away. When the women of the palace finished their business, they simply leaned forward with practiced ease and rubbed their fingertips into the plush fibers, letting the softness absorb what no one spoke of, what could not be named in polite conversation, letting the thick weave do the work that water and soap should have done, but did not, because water was dangerous and soap was harsh, and the body was not meant to be touched too much or too often. They believed, or at least they told themselves they believed, that the thick weave would cleanse without harm, that somehow the density of the fabric and the quality of its construction would purify through contact alone. The irony was that the rugs never saw a drop of clean water themselves, never knew the touch of soap or the scrubbing that might have actually cleaned them. They were beaten outside the windows when the dust became too visible, servants lifting them with effort and striking them with wooden paddles until clouds rose into the air, but never truly washed, never immersed or scrubbed or treated with anything that might actually remove what had accumulated in their fibers over weeks and months and sometimes years of use. In the quiet mornings, when the palace was still half asleep and the sun had not yet burned away the mist in the gardens, maids entered these chambers with their heads bowed in the posture of service they had been trained to maintain. They rolled the heavy rugs with difficulty, their weight substantial from both the quality of their construction and the moisture they had absorbed, carried them to the balconies where the fresh air seemed like a visitor from another world, and shook them carefully so as not to offend the eye with what might fall from them, so as not to create a spectacle that might be witnessed by someone whose opinion mattered. Dust rose in clouds, hair both human and otherwise drifted on the breeze, and dried residue that no one wanted to examine too closely floated out into the sunlight, where it dispersed and disappeared as though it had never existed. The maids would perfume the rugs afterward. This was essential. This was the step that made the whole system possible, sprinkling them with rose water that came in crystal bottles or violet oil imported from Grasse, where the best perfumes were made. This did not purify, did not sterilize, did not actually clean in any meaningful sense of the word. It disguised, it masked, it replaced one scent with another more acceptable one, and in Versailles, that was enough. That was all anyone asked for or expected. The thick scent filled the room once again, sweet and cloying and so strong it made the eyes water, masking the truth beneath layers of fragrance until you could almost forget what the rug had been used for, what it had absorbed, what secrets it held in its fibers. From that point on, the rug was ready for another day's service, placed back in its position beside the commode, its colors bright and its threads gleaming as though nothing had happened, as though it were fresh and new and innocent. It is like the idea of someone today spraying perfume on a kitchen cloth after weeks of use, just spraying and spraying until the chemical scent overpowers everything else, and declaring it fresh, declaring it ready to be used again, never mind what it has touched or absorbed or carried. But in Versailles, such absurdity was not only tolerated, but celebrated, considered a mark of sophistication, proof that one understood how to maintain elegance even in the most private moments, even in situations where elegance seemed impossible. Every corner of the palace followed the same strange code, a set of unwritten rules that everyone understood and no one questioned. Appearances ruled over hygiene with absolute authority, and elegance demanded denial, required that you ignore the evidence of your senses and trust instead in the story you were told, the narrative of perfection that held the entire world together. Ladies would adjust their gowns with careful hands, smoothing the silk over their hips, and step lightly over the very rug they had used moments before, their faces serene as paintings, their expressions revealing nothing of what had just occurred, their fingers gloved once again in lace or kidskin, as though the gloves could erase the memory of what had happened before they were put on. The servants removed nothing, replaced nothing that did not absolutely require replacement, and spoke of nothing, maintaining a silence that was as much a part of their uniform as the clothes they wore. The word dirt itself was unfit for such places, too crude, too direct, too honest for a palace that dealt only in euphemisms and gentle suggestions. Instead, people used gentler terms when they had to refer to such things at all, traces they would say, or essences, or simply residue. Words that softened the reality, that made it possible to acknowledge something without really acknowledging it, that allowed the conversation to continue without anyone having to face the truth directly. Everything unpleasant was softened by language, transformed through careful word choice into something that could coexist with gold and lace, that could exist in the same rooms where poetry was recited and music played and the most refined conversations of the age took place. The rugs absorbed it all, silent witnesses to the daily rituals of the most polished women in Europe, women whose images were painted by the greatest artists and whose manners were copied by aspiring nobles across the continent. They lay there day after day, year after year, growing heavier with time, their colors slowly dimming despite the perfume, their fibers matting together in ways that no amount of beating could fully reverse. Visitors to Versailles often praised the palace's perfection with enthusiasm that bordered on worship, writing letters home that described the glittering halls in breathless detail, the dazzling gowns that seemed to float rather than move, the endless perfumes that created an atmosphere unlike anywhere else in the world. Few noticed the faint mustiness beneath it all, or if they did, they attributed it to the age of the building, to the dampness that came from being so close to the gardens, to anything other than what it actually was. The air inside the private chambers carried a sweetness that turned heavy the longer one stayed, a cloying quality that seemed to stick to the skin and hair, that followed you even after you left the room. The mixture of unwashed fabric, layer upon layer of perfume applied over days and weeks, and warm air that never quite circulated properly created a fragrance unique to Versailles, something that could not be found anywhere else because nowhere else combined quite these elements in quite this way. Beautiful from afar, admired from a distance, but unsettling up close when you had to breathe it for hours, when it seeped into your clothes and hair and seemed to coat the inside of your throat. The women who lived there had long stopped noticing. Their noses had adapted, their senses had adjusted to the point where this seemed normal, where this seemed like simply the way things were. They believed that the scent of the palace itself was proof of nobility, evidence that they had transcended the ordinary concerns of ordinary people, as if only the truly refined could live surrounded by such air and not just survive but thrive, could move through these rooms day after day and year after year and never question whether something might be wrong. For these women, every movement had to appear effortless, had to look as though it required no thought or planning or effort whatsoever. To wash in the way common people washed would mean to labor, and labor was for servants, for people whose hands grew rough and whose backs grew bent, for those who had not been born into or married into the world of ease and elegance. Instead, they perfected gestures that looked clean, movements that suggested purity without actually achieving it, rituals that performed the idea of cleanliness rather than its reality. A dab of perfume on the wrist replaced soap and water, a touch of powder on the face replaced the freshness that comes from actually washing, and the rug, that soft, thick, beautiful rug, replaced water entirely in certain contexts, replaced the whole complicated business of basins and towels and the vulnerability of actual cleaning. It is strange to think that the same women who bathed in compliments from courtiers, who received praise for their beauty and grace and refinement, refused to bathe in actual water, refused to submit themselves to the simple act of washing that might have actually made them clean. Their concept of purity existed only in the mirror, only in the reflected image, where everything could be arranged into harmony, where powder could hide blemishes and perfume could mask odors, and the lighting was always flattering enough to obscure the truth. Sometimes, after the morning routines were done, after the face had been dabbed with questionable water, and the hair had been arranged, and the perfume had been applied in all the right places, the ladies would sit near the windows in chairs positioned to catch the best light, reading letters that had arrived from distant correspondents, or arranging their hair yet again with tools heated in the fire. Beneath their feet lay the same rug, now carrying the scent of perfume layered over everything it hid, everything it had absorbed, everything it refused to release. When the sunlight caught its fibers at certain angles, they glittered softly with a kind of deceitful beauty, the silver threads woven through the design catching the light and throwing it back in sparkles that distracted the eye from looking too closely, that suggested luxury rather than function, that made you think of art rather than utility. The rugs were never removed unless they became visibly worn, unless the traffic of feet and the weight of use had degraded them to the point where even perfume could not disguise their condition, and even then the replacements were treated the same way, placed in the same positions, used for the same purposes, subjected to the same cycle of use and perfume and denial. The idea of scrubbing or washing them with soap and hot water was unthinkable, would have seemed absurd to anyone who suggested it. Water might ruin the fabric, they said, might cause the colors to run or the fibers to shrink or the shape to distort, and these rugs were far too valuable to risk such damage. In truth, it might only have revealed what they preferred not to see, might have released odors that perfume kept trapped, might have shown stains that the dim light of the chambers kept hidden, might have forced them to confront directly what they had worked so hard to ignore. In the servants' quarters, in those dim rooms in the upper floors or basement corridors where the people who actually kept the palace functioning ate and slept and whispered, whispers traveled quietly through the darkness. The maids knew what clung to those rugs with an intimacy that their mistresses could never imagine, would never want to imagine. They were the ones who lifted them, feeling the weight that should not have been there, who coughed through clouds of old perfume and powder when shaking them out over the balconies, whose hands touched the damp spots that perfume could not quite dry. Some pitied their mistresses, saw them as trapped in a system they had not created and could not escape, prisoners of expectations and appearances. Others despised them, resented the casual cruelty of people who would use a rug for such purposes and then expect someone else to handle the consequences, who created messes they never had to clean and smells they never had to acknowledge. But none dared speak openly. None could afford to, not if they wanted to keep their positions, not if they wanted to continue earning the wages that fed their families. Versailles ran on silence as much as on gold, on the unspoken agreement that certain truths would never be acknowledged, that certain realities would remain forever behind closed doors. To notice filth was to be vulgar, and vulgarity was worse than sickness, worse than dirt, worse than any physical ailment, because it revealed that you did not understand the rules, that you lacked the refinement necessary to pretend. The court's logic was inverted, turned inside out and upside down. What was clean might make you ill, they believed. The shock of cold water on warm skin, the harshness of soap on delicate complexions, these were dangerous, these were to be avoided. But what was filthy could be made safe with a touch of fragrance, with enough perfume and enough denial and enough collective agreement to maintain the illusion. It was belief, not reason, that ruled the body in Versailles. Faith in appearances rather than evidence, trust in what everyone said rather than what your own senses told you. By evening, when the last light had faded from the sky and the candles had been lit throughout the palace glowed with a warmth that seemed almost magical from a distance. Guests danced in the great halls where the air was thick with perfume and the sound of music, where hundreds of candles burned in chandeliers overhead and cast shadows that moved like living things, while the same rugs lay quietly beneath layers of skirts and shoes, hidden under the traffic of the evening, covered by the movement of bodies and the swish of fabric. The elegance of the scene was hypnotic, had a power that made you forget to question, that made everything seem right simply because it was beautiful. Musicians played instruments that cost more than houses, jewels glittered on throats and wrists and in hair, and the scent of roses filled the halls so completely that it seemed to replace the very air. But hidden within that fragrance, buried beneath the layers of pleasant scent, was the sour echo of the morning's rituals, the trace of everything that had happened behind closed doors, the accumulated evidence of a day lived according to the strange rules of Versailles. If the rugs could speak, and sometimes I imagine they could, that they held within their fibers the memory of everything they had witnessed, they would tell of 1,000 delicate hands wiping away evidence, and 1,000 bottles of perfume poured over them to hide what had been done. They would tell of how beauty in that world depended entirely on denial, on the willingness to ignore what you knew to be true, on the ability to smell roses and convince yourself there was nothing else. They would describe the texture of lies, the weight of secrets, the strange lightness that comes when you finally stop fighting reality and simply accept that this is how things are, that this is how they will always be. I often think about how those women, draped in satin and lace worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, believed they were living at the height of civilization, at the very pinnacle of human achievement and refinement, while beneath their feet lay the truth they refused to touch, the evidence they refused to see, the smell they refused to acknowledge. Their rugs were metaphors for Versailles itself when you think about it, dazzling on the surface with their intricate patterns and rich colors and threads of precious metal, but rotting underneath with accumulated filth that no amount of perfume could truly eliminate. Every act of grace contained something unspeakable, something human that had to be hidden away, something that could not be reconciled with the image they worked so hard to maintain. Cleanliness, as they understood it, was not a state of being but a performance, not something you achieved but something you demonstrated. Not about actually being clean, but about appearing clean, about maintaining the illusion so convincingly that even you sometimes believed it. The rugs endured silently through it all, year after year and decade after decade, absorbing years of habits and secrets and denials, each one becoming heavier with time, darker despite the bright colors of its design, more perfumed in a desperate attempt to stay ahead of the reality that threatened always to break through. They symbolized the strange luxury of a court that preferred illusion to comfort and beauty to health, that would rather suffer in scented silence than acknowledge that something might be wrong, that something might need to change. To live in Versailles was to exist in a carefully choreographed lie, a performance that ran from the moment you woke until the moment you slept, and even sleep was not exempt from the requirements of elegance. Every gesture was rehearsed until it became automatic, every scent calculated with the precision of a mathematical formula, every stain ignored with a determination that bordered on madness. Even the smallest detail, the way a woman wiped her hands after using the commode, carried the weight of pride and decay intertwined, inseparable, each one giving meaning to the other. They called it refinement because it smelled of flowers, because the surface appeared beautiful, because everyone else called it refinement, and to disagree would be to mark yourself as someone who did not belong. But underneath, it was simply the scent of denial, refusing to die, the odor of truth that no amount of rosewater could permanently eliminate. They believed they were preserving grace, maintaining standards, upholding the dignity of their station and their sex. But they were only teaching themselves to live with filth, to normalize it, to incorporate it so completely into their daily lives that it became invisible, that it ceased to register as anything unusual or wrong. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all, the one that should make us pause and wonder about our own practices and beliefs, is that those golden rugs, those beautiful, expensive works of art meant to symbolize purity and power and the wealth that made such luxury possible, were nothing more than soft, perfumed graves for the truth, burial sites for reality, monuments to the human capacity for self-deception. They were touched by hundreds of hands and absorbed thousands of secrets, and lay witness to the daily proof that all the gold in France could not purchase honesty. In the private rooms of Versailles, far from the public halls where ambassadors bowed and dancers whirled, the air itself seemed to have been perfumed into submission. Every inch of space carried a scent that was both beautiful and overwhelming, from the velvet curtains that had been hanging for decades to the silk gowns that were worn multiple times before anyone considered cleaning them. Behind this wall of elegance was an odd, nearly pitiful ritual that blurred the line between beauty and waste until you could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. When the scent on a lady's skin began to fade, when the perfume she had applied that morning had been absorbed or evaporated or simply exhausted its ability to mask what lay beneath, she did not reach for a fresh bottle stored carefully on her dressing table. Instead, she took up a thin handkerchief, often the same one she had used that morning to dab at her face or cover a cough, and gently pressed it against her neck and wrists where perfume always sat. The cloth absorbed what little fragrance remained, mixing it with the warmth of her skin and the powder from her makeup, and the oils that human skin produces naturally, no matter how much we wish it would not. Then, in a gesture that seemed both strange and perfectly routine to everyone involved, both bizarre and completely normal, she wrung that cloth into a basin of water with the same care one might use for something precious. The liquid that fell was cloudy, you could not see through it clearly, tinted faintly with the color of makeup and scented with roses or musk or whatever perfume she had chosen that day, and it became her lotion, her means of refreshing herself without actually washing, her way of maintaining the illusion. With calm precision born of years of practice, she dipped her fingers into it and smoothed it once more over her arms and throat, reapplying what had already been used, recycling her own scent, never questioning whether this might not be the best approach to personal care. It is almost laughable when you step back and think about it clearly, almost absurd enough to make you smile in the darkness, that the palace of perfection found virtue in washing the body with perfume that had already been used, that had already spent hours on skin, that had already mixed with sweat and powder and all the things that perfume is meant to cover. For the women of Versailles, nothing was to be wasted, not even scent, not even the faint trace of fragrance that clung to a handkerchief. Perfume was more than luxury. It was more than a pleasant addition to one's toilet. It was reputation itself. It was identity. It was the invisible crown that everyone wore and everyone could smell. To smell pleasant was to appear pure, no matter what hid beneath the silk and lace, no matter what your actual body might be doing beneath the layers of fabric and denial. So the ritual of reusing fragrance became common, an unspoken secret passed between ladies' maids and their mistresses, a practice that everyone engaged in but no one discussed openly, because to discuss it would be to acknowledge what it really was. The cloth, after absorbing the remnants of the morning scent, was never discarded as you might expect, never thrown away or even washed thoroughly. It was pressed carefully, folded with the same attention one might give to a letter from a lover, and reused again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. The soft fabric darkened gradually over time, taking on a yellowish tinge from the oils of skin and the residue of perfume, becoming something that looked nothing like what it had been when it was new. When dipped into water, those traces created a diluted mixture that was neither cleanly water nor truly perfume, but something in between. A ghost of fragrance that could be spread again to maintain the illusion of freshness, to delay the inevitable moment when the body's natural scent would break through the defenses and reveal the truth. It is as absurd as the idea of collecting the steam from an old candle and calling it new light, of capturing something that has already served its purpose and pretending it can serve that purpose again unchanged. The irony would be funny if it were not so sad, if it did not reveal something profound about the desperation beneath all that beauty. Servants played a crucial role in this strange cycle of refinement that was really a cycle of desperation, though they would never have dared to call it that. Each morning they laid out fresh linens that were not actually fresh, bowls of water that would not be used for actual washing, and bottles of scent that cost more than they earned in a month. But by evening, when the light had faded and the candles had burned low, the bowls held murky mixtures of perfume residue and sweat and the accumulated evidence of a day spent maintaining appearances, which the women dabbed onto their skin with graceful indifference, never acknowledging what they were really doing, never speaking the truth aloud. To them, this was sophistication. This was the mark of someone who understood the finer things, who knew that cleanliness was not about water and soap, but about maintaining an aura, about being the kind of person who smelled right and looked right and existed in the right way. To wash with plain water, water that came from a well or a river, or even the palace's unreliable pipes, water that was just water with nothing added and nothing special about it, would have been vulgar, would have been beneath them, would have been a confession that they were no different from the servants or the merchants or the peasants outside the palace walls. Clean water, unadorned by scent or color or history, belonged to peasants and laundresses whose hands were red from work. A Versailles lady must never appear practical, must never do anything that suggested she understood or cared about the actual mechanics of cleanliness, must never acknowledge that bodies require maintenance just like anything else. Even her cleanliness had to shimmer with artifice, had to be complicated and difficult and layered with meaning, had to tell a story about who she was and what she represented. The smell of these makeshift lotions filled the palace halls throughout the day and night, soft and intoxicating at first breath, but faintly sour if you inhaled too deeply, if you really paid attention to what you were smelling rather than simply accepting it. As night fell and the palace settled into its evening rhythms, the air grew heavy with layers of reused fragrance, each woman carrying her own version of it, her own unique combination. Rose blended with musk from one, lavender with faint notes of decay from another, jasmine mixed with something indefinably human from a third. But rather than disgust, rather than anyone acknowledging that something was not quite right, this smell was celebrated as evidence of sophistication, proof that you belonged, a sign that you understood the unspoken rules. It was the scent of belonging to the court, of sharing in its rituals and its secrets, of being initiated into a world that others could only dream of entering. Men complimented it without realizing what they inhaled, without understanding that what they praised as richness and depth was actually the smell of perfume that had been used and reused and mixed with human sweat and human oils until it bore only a distant relationship to what had originally been in the bottle. They praised its complexity, not knowing that complexity was just another word for contamination, not knowing that the layers they admired were layers of denial rather than layers of art. The women accepted these compliments with smiles that revealed nothing, with gracious nods that suggested mystery, never correcting the misunderstanding because to correct it would be to shatter the illusion, and the illusion was everything. In truth, perfume was the only mask Versailles could not remove, the only disguise that had to be maintained at all times without exception. It clung to everything with a tenacity that seemed almost supernatural, to hair that was rarely washed, to furniture that absorbed it year after year, to sheets that were perfumed rather than cleaned, even to the air itself, which seemed to hold scent longer in Versailles than it did anywhere else, as though the very atmosphere had learned to cooperate with the deception. The palace was a world built on fragrance and denial, two forces that worked together to create something that could not exist with only one or the other, that required both in equal measure. Women feared smelling human, feared the natural scent of skin and breath and life, feared being revealed as creatures of flesh rather than creatures of porcelain and silk, so they learned to smell layered, to smell complicated, to smell like anything except what they actually were. When the fresh scent faded, as it always did after a few hours, they recycled it rather than applying something new, reusing what had already been used, extending the life of perfume past its natural limits. When that faded too, as it inevitably did, they mixed it with something new, creating combinations that were unique to each individual, that became signature scents not through choice, but through accident and desperation. It was a constant circle of disguise that never quite closed, that always left a gap where reality could peek through if you knew where to look. To smell clean, they reused what was already soiled. To appear delicate, they clung to the residue of decay. To maintain their position, they accepted practices that undermined their health. And through it all, they smiled and pretended everything was exactly as it should be. The science of hygiene, such as it existed in that era, had no place here in this world. The women were told that perfume could cleanse, that it had properties beyond simply smell and pleasant, that flowers touched by dew and sun had purifying powers that could somehow transfer to human skin if the flowers were processed correctly and applied with proper ritual. The science of hygiene, such as it existed in that era, had no place here in this world. The women were told that perfume could cleanse, that it had properties beyond simply smelling pleasant, that flowers touched by dew and sun had purifying powers that could somehow transfer to human skin if the flowers were processed correctly and applied with proper ritual. They believed that roses softened the skin through some mystical process, that musk drew out impurities from beneath the surface, that certain combinations could actually improve health rather than simply masking its absence. In truth, and we know this now though they did not, these mixtures only trapped dirt beneath the surface, clogging pores that needed to breathe, inflaming skin that needed rest, creating conditions where infection could flourish in the warm darkness beneath silk and perfume. Yet pain was ignored in favor of grace, discomfort was accepted as the price of beauty, and any suggestion that perhaps this was not the best method was dismissed as ignorance. If the lotion stung, if it burned when applied to sensitive skin, that was the mark of refinement, proof that it was strong enough to work, evidence of its power. If the scent was too strong, if it made your eyes water or your head ache, that meant it was working properly, that it was potent enough to overcome the natural smell of human skin. The more it hurt, the more they smiled, the more they endured, the more they were praised for their dedication to beauty. Versailles turned suffering into ritual with the efficiency of a factory, and ritual into elegance with the conviction of faith, and elegance into something that justified any price, any pain, any compromise of health or comfort. I can almost see those rooms in my mind when I close my eyes. Rooms filled with mirrors that reflected candlelight and created an illusion of endless space, where beauty meant reapplying yesterday's perfume with today's hope and calling it rebirth, calling it renewal, calling it anything except what it actually was. The maids, ever silent because silence was the price of employment, were the ones who saw the truth most clearly because they were the ones who handled the physical evidence. They carried the basins away each night, heavy with water that had turned cloudy from reused perfume and clumps of powder that had been dissolved and reconstituted so many times it barely resembled powder anymore. They emptied these basins into gutters or gardens, watching as the liquid soaked into the ground and left stains that perfume could not hide, marks of what really happened behind all the beauty. The next morning they returned with new flowers to steep in the same bowls, hiding the staleness beneath the illusion of freshness, placing rose petals on water that had been used for things no rose ever knew. They watched as their mistresses repeated the same routine day after day after day, dabbing with practiced motions, wringing with careful pressure, patting with gentle touches, and breathing deeply as if surrounded by holiness, as if participating in something sacred rather than something that was slowly poisoning them. It was a strange devotion when you think about it, a worship of scent that replaced real purity with fantasy so complete that reality had no power to break through. In the grand corridors where courtiers strolled and whispered and plotted, the smell became part of the identity of Versailles itself, as recognizable as its architecture or its art. Visitors from other courts, from Vienna and Madrid and London, often spoke of the fragrance that clung to the palace like a visible presence, describing it in letters and diaries as both divine and oppressive, both intoxicating and suffocating, both beautiful and somehow wrong in ways they could not quite articulate. They could not tell where the perfume ended and the rot began, could not identify the line that separated luxury from decay, because that line had been erased so thoroughly that it might never have existed at all. The boundary between luxury and decay had dissolved completely in Versailles, melted away under the heat of candles and the pressure of expectations, until everything existed in a strange middle ground where nothing was entirely one thing or another. The palace became a bottle that could never be emptied, always refilled with the same residue disguised as new, the same old perfume presented as fresh, the same lies told with such consistency that they became indistinguishable from truth. At the heart of this ritual, beneath all the gestures and the smells and the carefully maintained illusions, was fear, plain and simple. Fear of being ordinary, of smelling mortal, of revealing the body beneath the gown, of being discovered as human after all. Every woman at court lived in terror of imperfection, of being found wanting, of failing to maintain the standards that everyone pretended were natural and effortless, when in fact they required constant, exhausting work. They were taught to preserve the illusion of beauty at any cost, no matter how high that cost became, no matter what it demanded of their bodies or their health or their sense of truth. Even as their skin itched from the chemicals in the perfume, even as their pores burned from being clogged, even as their perfumes turned sour from being reused beyond any reasonable limit, they smiled those perfect smiles and accepted compliments with gracious nods and never once admitted that anything was wrong. Cleanliness became theater, where everyone knew their lines, and scent became its costume, the disguise that every actor wore. The more artificial it became, the further it moved from anything natural or healthy, the more noble it appeared, the more it seemed like proof of superiority, evidence of having transcended the common struggles that afflicted ordinary people. By evening, when the day's performances finally ended and they entered the ballroom beneath glittering chandeliers that held hundreds of candles, their perfumes still lingered faintly on the air around them, though it had been reapplied from the same reused mixture that had been on their skin that morning, that had been wrung from handkerchiefs and mixed with water and dabbed on again as though it were fresh. The men bowed low, the women curtsied with perfect grace, and the air grew thick with sweetness layered over exhaustion, with roses layered over resignation, with beauty layered over the slow accumulation of everything that beauty was meant to hide. The mirrors that lined the walls reflected faces that glowed softly in the candlelight, glowed not from health or happiness, but from oil and powder and the sheen of skin that had been treated with diluted perfume water that carried the scent of the entire day. And yet, to those around them, to anyone who was not looking too closely or thinking too carefully, they looked divine, looked like creatures from a better world, looked like everything the court was supposed to be. The illusion was complete, polished to perfection through years of practice and generations of accumulated wisdom about how to maintain appearances. The palace smelled perfect so long as no one breathed too deeply, so long as no one asked questions that had no acceptable answers, so long as everyone agreed to maintain the collective fiction that made Versailles possible. They believed that reusing perfume made them thrifty and refined, made them careful stewards of luxury rather than wasteful consumers, made them sophisticated in ways that people who simply washed with soap and water could never understand. But it only made them prisoners of their own illusion, trapped in a cycle they had not created and could not escape, maintaining practices that made less sense the more you thought about them. They mistook the smell of old fragrance for proof of grace, for evidence of something elevated and special, never realizing it was the scent of decay refusing to die, of rot dressed in silk, of truth buried under so many layers of lies that even they could no longer find it. And perhaps the saddest truth of all, the one that should make us pause and think about our own lives and our own deceptions, is that the air of Versailles, remembered for its beauty in countless memoirs and histories, described as magical by those who visited and those who lived there, was nothing more than the perfume of things too proud to be washed away, too invested in their own image to admit that something had gone terribly wrong somewhere along the way. They created beauty from reuse and called it wisdom, they made virtue from recycling decay, and they built an empire on the foundation of lies so well perfumed that everyone forgot they were lies at all. And now, as the candles of this story fade and the echoes of that perfumed silence settle into the darkness around you, it feels right to release the breath they were never allowed to take, to exhale on their behalf after centuries of holding still. The women of Versailles lived in a world that demanded perfection over peace, that chose illusion over comfort every single time, that valued grace over truth so completely that truth ceased to have any currency at all. They spent their lives whispering through the walls of history, trapped in a stillness that was not natural but imposed, remembered only for how beautifully they managed to hide everything that was real about them. But here, in this quiet moment between sleep and waking, their long silence has ended. Their stories have been told not with judgment but with understanding, not with shock but with the recognition that every age has its own forms of madness, its own ways of confusing suffering with sophistication. So close your eyes now, let the weight of their world drift away like perfume dissipating in fresh air. Let the silence soften into rest that is genuine rather than performed, into stillness that comes from peace rather than from fear. You have listened long enough to the noise of perfection, to the endless performance, to the exhausting theater of appearing flawless. It is time to breathe again, deeply and freely, without perfume or powder or any disguise at all. It is time to rest in your own skin, in your own scent, in your own perfectly imperfect humanity. The women of Versailles never had that freedom, but you do. So take it, embrace it, and let yourself drift into sleep where no one is watching, where no one is judging, where you can finally, completely, beautifully be nothing more and nothing less than human. Good night, dear friends. May your dreams be clean, gentle, and free. May you wake tomorrow not to the smell of roses hiding rot, but to fresh air and honest light. May you never confuse suffering with elegance, or silence with peace, or the ability to hide pain with the achievement of grace. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and when you dream of palaces, may they smell of truth instead of perfume.